Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Arc of Thoughts podcast. In today's episode, we're talking about the impact of early Muslim migrants to Britain. Now, what we want to do is we want to talk about the early Muslim migrants that came to Britain at the turn of the 20th century. As for what has potentially happened between the time of the Prophet ﷺ all the way until the 20th century, I think the information is a bit grey, and I mean, that's not of particular interest to us. Um, Now, as we mentioned before, we're both from the subcontinent, right? And we want to talk about the migrants that have come from the subcontinent, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the impacts that they had as Muslims come into this country, their life, and what they did. Um, but at the same time, we also recognize that it wasn't just subcontinental Muslims that came to this country. There were many other different migrant Muslims that came to the country. We know that there were different Arabs and there were Somalis and many others from East Africa and West Africa that came to Britain. But unfortunately, I mean, like, I don't know about yourself, but I don't know much about that. And whilst we will talk about from our perspective and what we know from our families and our grandparents and the people within our community, I'd love to hear about if you are from a different community. Maybe you might be Arab or you might be Somalian or you might be from a different community, but please do tell us. And I would love to hear comments from yourself about the impacts or individuals who have had impact in your communities as Muslims to help the cause of Islam and to help benefit the Muslims within this country. We essentially want to celebrate what they've done so far, because I think the sort of the mindset of many young Muslims now is to negate the impact and the effects and the sacrifices that have been given by our predecessors. Whilst we acknowledge that there were mistakes that were made, and there are mistakes that are potentially still being made as well, but that doesn't negate away from the goodness that they have done. And what we want to do is highlight these good things that they have done for the benefit and the platform that they've provided for us now, as well as talking about what our mindset or what our intention should be going forward as well. Um, so let's make a start. But just before we do, as always, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel to follow our journey. Do like this video as well. And if you find it beneficial, then please do share with your friends and family. So let's begin, inshallah, Kasim. So the first two personalities that I want to speak about is talking about sort of shaping modern Britain and shaping the environment for Islam to come into modern Britain. And I think these are two personalities who should be in the minds, or every sort of Muslim that lives within Britain now should have an understanding or should at least be aware of these two names. And the two names in particular that I'm talking about is Abdullah Quilliam, Abdullah being the name that he took after he reverted and became Muslim, and Muhammad Pickthall, who many, mashallah, will be aware. He basically made the first English translation of the Quran by somebody whose native language was English, whilst also being a Muslim. So these are some of the sort of catches that we got to lay down, because there were other English translations of the Quran that existed, but generally they were written by non-Muslims who were trying to discredit the Quran and were describing the Prophet ﷺ, na'udhu to be somebody who had made a claim for prophethood when really that they did not believe that. But we won't go too much into that. Now, the sort of we need to talk about the sort of environment that these two reverts and Muslims, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings and mercy be upon them, the environment that they came into. They came into a society who were very, very hostile towards Muslims, right? To an extent where these two personalities, when they accepted Islam, they were shunned by the society that they lived in. Even though they were shunned by the society, they carried on in their efforts for deen. So we know that Abdullah Quilliam set up a masjid in Liverpool, very, very famous masjid. And he was the imam and the khatib there. And he was, preaching to an audience of at least approximately about 500 Muslims, along with some of the sailors that were coming in and out from various Arab countries, as well as maybe even the subcontinent as well. On the other hand, Marmaduke Pickthall, after becoming Muslim, he was basically shunned out from the country. If I remember correctly, he was even accused of and was potentially going to be tried for treason for becoming Muslim. That's crazy to think of, right? That because he accepted Islam, he had been charged. I think he had been charged, or he at least had been accused of treason, which is like one of the worst crimes that you can have in this country. He left the country. He went to India, and it was in India where basically he made the translation of the Quran that many of us will be famous with today. Alhamdulillah. But what was the reason for them choosing Islam? Just briefly to sort of summarize, I think they realized that there were some issues that were prevalent within British society at the time that were against morality, that were even against the teachings of Christianity as well. But they just felt that Christianity wasn't providing the solutions for these. So they decided that, well, they basically had traveled, and that links into the previous episode. We were talking about traveling and how it opens the mind. And they traveled, especially towards the Muslim lands. Abdullah Quilliam traveling to Morocco, Marmaduke Pickthall traveling to the Ottoman Empire and the lands that we know as Turkey, and basically seeing the practice of Islam and seeing that as the solution to the problems that existed in Britain. That's a crazy thought for me to think about, Kasim, right? That they went to the lands of the Muslims and they saw something which would solve the problems of Britain, right? And if they saw that at the turn of the 20th century and just before the 20th century, what about us now? Should we not be seeing that now as well? What do you think?
It's alhamdulillah, I think we all live in hope from a young age. We might not have seen it in action, but alhamdulillah, we've said it before, so Islam has all the solutions. But I think the bigger problem in it is admitting that your society has problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing where we fall down, is that we tend to think that our society is the best, and even then, at the turn of the 20th century, these people are living in what you would say a modern society.
Mm.
At the time, they did some sort of vehicle, some sort of radio, television, food, and all this sort of stuff. They weren't living in like caves, or they weren't living where they didn't have any sort of technology advancement.
Mm-hmm.
But for them to realize the problems that they had and to admit that and to actually want to find a solution, that's like an amazing achievement within itself.
Mm.
The fact of embarking on that journey, going to do it, that's something else. That's something amazing, something extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see the changes they had in British society.
Yeah. I think like the really interesting part is about how they were outcast from their societies, and they were treated as like they were renegades.
But that's nothing new.
Yeah,
Like, let's be honest, like the not the battle, yeah, but the ideological battle between like Muslims and Christians, or you can say ideological Christians who want maybe just like land and empire
mm-hmm.
under the name of Christianity, have always been against Muslims. Look at the Crusades.
Mm.
It's always been Christians from Europe attacking the Muslims or pushing them further back and taking their land and stuff. It's never for any other reason. You don't see the average European benefiting from that. It's just the elite. And this sort of mindset has like unfortunately it's trickled through into normal society.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, it's using Christianity as a means of bettering themselves.
Yeah, I think the two personalities that we've mentioned so far, I think their lives are really interesting, Kasim. And I think as us living in modern Britain now, I think it would be very very beneficial for all of us to sort of understand what their struggles were and like how they sort of dealt with it as well. There's quite a lot of work that's actually being produced as well, which would definitely, I think, for those who are interested, they can definitely go and check that out. I think that's like sort of the impact that took place at the turn of the 20th century before the World Wars. And I believe that at that time there were especially like a lot of Yemenis that had come across to Britain. I think Yemen was actually a colony of the British Empire, and therefore there was like a lot of the sort of sailors and stuff who came across, who were asked to work, and a lot, especially in a lot of the port cities. Yemenis were very Liverpool, Newcastle, Cardiff is another example as well, where the Yemenis were very prevalent. I sort of want to mention all of this as sort of a precursor because whilst obviously their what they provided is very important, but necessarily that doesn't isn't necessarily the topic of conversation that we want to talk about today. But I did still want to mention them because at the end of the day, they were Muslims that had come to Britain, and they did provide different benefits to society. And you could maybe even argue that they opened the doors for the flurry of the subcontinental Muslims that came later on after World War II in the 50s and 60s. But that's more our sort of topic of conversation, and that's probably more the reason being behind that is because that's what our heritage is, and that's what we want to discuss. And we appreciate that many of the listeners also will agree, or so will be from the same sort of demographic, which is why we want to talk about that. So let's talk about that, Kasim. Let's start. We know that many subcontinental Muslims migrated away from where they were living, but obviously mainly in the subcontinent, also from places like Malawi and places in Africa as well, moved and came to Britain. Obviously, there was a big push from the then British government at the time that they wanted these migrant people to come to work in the UK,
Yep.
Especially after the war, to basically boost the economy, right?
To basically rebuild the country.
Yeah, to rebuild the country.
In simple words.
And there was a big push for that. Now, we understand. Okay, so we explained why the Brits wanted the migrant workers to come, but why did the Muslims from the subcontinent, why did they want to come to Britain?
Naturally, when any person sees any sort of like chance for economic benefit, they'll ultimately take that chance and go.
Mhm.
The same reason why Muslims migrated to the UK. It's the same reason they migrate to the USA. It's because of economic benefit first and foremost, and then other motives come later. There were very, very few that would have came here, would have been sent here for the sake of the propagation of Islam.
Yeah.
Majority of Muslims came because and there's actually nothing wrong with that. As long as you go there, you live by the rules, you perform your activities as a Muslims, alhamdulillah, and that can benefit you and the Muslim ummah, then alhamdulillah.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting, like, that they come across for, is there economic benefit, like you mentioned? I mean, what are sort of the evidences for that? If you look at it, when they came, it was only then generally the men folk that came.
Yeah.
The women folk stayed behind to wherever they were. Even men who were married, they would leave their wives behind, and they would travel to Britain. It's very common, like if we speak to like our grandfather's generation and things like that, where we get this sort of information from. Sorry, you wanted to mention something?
It's because you saying that a lot of the men came. That's because they had this mindset that we're gonna work in Britain for a bit and go back to our country. That was the sort of mindset which they came with.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting point that you're mentioning here. That was their mindset, because if you bring your spouse with you, that's a sign that you're planning on like settling down.
Yeah.
The fact that you leave behind key family members in the country that you've come from, that suggests that you plan to go back there because you've left something of great importance back there. And I think this gives it a sort of gives us the ability to put ourselves in the minds of those people that came, that they weren't coming to spend a long period of time. They were just coming to basically earn their money and to return back. And we know that in many cases that didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
In many cases, what happened after a few years was the women folk started to come as well. But what I want to do is I just want to talk about at that point in time in the 50s and 60s, when all of these Muslim men are coming, what was their life like? Like, what was their living conditions? How was their religious life? Do you have like any ideas about these kind of things?
From what we've heard even from our own parents, like, let's be honest, religious life was practically non-existent. Illa mashallah, except for a few. And the conditions were they used to work 12 hours a day, or maybe 14, 16 hours a day, come home, sleep, and then go back to work, and that was their life. Let's be honest.
So
that's what I know, that's what I've heard, and that's just in a very, very simple way.
Yeah, so I've heard like stories from my own grandfather as well, who came here, and they were living in houses where basically there was just the entire house was basically just the kitchen, the bathroom, and all the other rooms were basically bedrooms, right? And there would be multiple beds within each room.
Mattresses, not beds.
Mattresses.
On the floor.
Sorry. And you never came home to a cold bed.
No,
this is the story that my uncle has told me. That he never came home to a cold bed, and the reason was because everybody worked shift patterns, and essentially whilst you were working, somebody was sleeping inside of your bed. And when you returned from work, it was in that person's time to go for the shift, right? So you always came back to a warm bed that somebody else had basically just got out of. And that's the way that these people, they live their lives. Like, maybe 10 people within one house, all living together.
It's like completely illegal now, but back then it was fine.
But that's the way that they lived their life. It was basically work, sleep, work, come home, sleep, wake up, get ready to go work, and go back. I think it wasn't uncommon for people to be working like 6 days a week, maybe even 7 days a week as well. In terms of their religious life, I think one of the most stark things that I've heard was the Jummah Salah would not be performed on a Friday. Okay. The Jummah Salah would be performed on a Sunday because that was the day off that they got from work, and that was the time when the community could sort of come together. So I think that's just crazy to think about, that the Friday prayer that we all come towards, irrespective of whether a person does or doesn't perform his salah in the rest of the week, the Friday prayer is one of great significance. And the Jummah Salah is one in which the entire community comes together, and everyone comes to the masjid. And the fact that that didn't take place on a Friday, it used to take place on a Sunday, right, it's crazy to think about that such a time existed. And we're not talking like hundreds of years ago, we're talking just a couple of generations away. That's what used to happen. I think that gives a sort of idea about the work-life balance that these people had. But the crazy thing to think is that even whilst all of this was going on, and even though that these people, they didn't necessarily come across, they came across for economic benefit, they still gave great sacrifices for the establishment of Islamic institutions slowly. So as more and more people started to come across, there became more and more people naturally who were more religiously inclined, who also came across, who then made efforts on those people who had come. And what started to happen was people started to sacrifice their monthly salaries that they were getting not for the establishment of their own lives, but for the lives of Masajid, right? Now we're very lucky in that we live in the area in Blackburn, in the northwest of England, where we have many Masajid that have already been set up and stuff. But these Masajid didn't get set up without the blood, sweat, and tears, and the sacrifices of money that was given by our elders, and by our predecessors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon all of them. Whatever little that they earned, what tended to happen was they would be putting away a set amount every month, every week, for the establishment of these Islamic institutions, because whilst their families started to come over, they started to realize that their children were now not gaining an education or a grounding in terms of their Islamic education, and there was a keen interest for their children to become Muslims and to live a better life.
To stay Muslims.
Yeah, to stay Muslims. And essentially, these elders, they sacrificed their own houses or their own quality of life or the luxuries of their life for the sake of these establishments to be set up. And it's my belief and my understanding that if we had to go through the same, if our generation had to go through something similar, where we had to set up the establishment, these institutions, and gather together money, we wouldn't be able to fund half, not even a quarter, right? Maybe not even 10% of what these people have done. The sacrifices that they gave, I don't think we can do that. I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't think we could do that.
We're not willing to, it's another conversation, but we're not willing to pay our own institutions properly, or benefit or donate towards them. Never mind sacrificing our wage slip. That's a long way away.
Yeah.
And the environment that they came in, even though they were earning a little, they didn't have much money. We have more money than they ever did.
Yeah.
But the barakat and whatever came out of that money is far superior than whatever we'll ever do.
Yeah.
You have to look at the conditions of the time. It wasn't easy living in England. Just look at the weather. Today, kids can't get out of a room, or if you go to a room when it's cold, there's no heater in there, can't sit in there. People need their houses to be a certain way. Like, these people didn't care about that stuff. They had bigger ideas in their mind, they had, like you're saying, that vision, vision, and they did everything to get to it.
I think the other thing is that like you mentioned about like their quality of life and the way that they used to live their lives as well, that at that time didn't want to be seen as a Muslim. Like many people, when they came across, and you will find this, like, if you look at pictures of, if you can find pictures of your grandparents when they originally came to the country, you'll notice that in the pictures they're clean shaven. They don't have beard. They removed their beard when they came, before they came, or pretty much as soon as they came, to an extent where I've even heard stories of when the milkman would come round, and the milkman is like a dying concept now, right? But
You still see if you're knocking about.
well, I still have a milkman. But yeah, when the milkman would come round and deliver the milk, to go answer the door to collect the milk, if a person was wearing like a kameez or a kurta or a jubba inside of their house, jubba being very rare to be honest at that time, but a salwar kameez in the house, they would go and get changed into a suit and tie to open the door because they were fearful about being seen in the jubbas and kurtas. To be honest, it was very common for, like, especially our grandparents to be amongst like the best dressed in society as well. I remember that being like a very big thing. But again, like these kind of things, like, they're unheard of. We don't think about them. We don't need to. We do have our own challenges. Don't get me wrong. Like we still have challenges that exist within society, and trying to integrate within society as well. But the kind of challenges that our grandparents and the generation that was before them and that sort of era that they had, we don't have them challenges. Alhamdulillah, because they came to sacrifices for us to have the lives that we're living now. I don't know if there's anything else that you sort of want to mention on that particular point.
I think you mentioned something that I've been most of the things anyway. Nothing's coming to mind. Like you said, our challenges are a bit different the day and age that we're living in.
Yeah. So I think, like, to continue then, I think what I want to do is that I want to sort of like bring it in a bit of a loop. So we started off the conversation talking about like two big personalities that were there at the turn of like the 20th century, that were in modern Britain. And I want to talk about two personalities that were here at the turn of the 21st century. So I did the introduction for the two at the start. Do you want to introduce the two that we're talking about in the 21st century, what they did, what their vision, what sort of their vision was, and how they sort of implemented that vision? I'll leave you to mention.
So the first one was how should we say the names that people know?
Okay, so
generally,
I think he's known as Hafiz Patel.
Okay.
So we'll stick with Hafiz Patel, Rahmatullah
عليه رحمة الله. As far as I know, he actually didn't come here because he wanted to come here. As far as I know, I'm sure he was sent.
Okay.
And this was very common. Scholars around the world, this is what happens when you travel. People think, oh, scholars living on the other side of the world, they don't know what's going on in our Western society. Sometimes they know a lot more than we ever do. So as far as I'm not wrong, he was actually sent here for the propagation of Islam.
Okay. So from what I've heard, and I'm going to include a link to the obituary as well below, which will explain in a bit more detail. So that will provide a better picture. But as far as I know, he had migrated originally already, as mentioned, to gain benefit from this country. And at the time, as Hafiz Patel, he had an inclination towards deen and religion already. He lived in London at the time, and he was running like a sort of madrasa at the time as well, where he would teach the young kids. So whilst not qualified as a scholar himself, he was Hafiz of the Quran, and therefore he was seen as more religious than others, and therefore he was sort of given the responsibility. I know a very famous scholar of the time right now that exists in the country, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. He mentions that when he first reverted to Islam in his youth, he remembers sitting in the class of Hafiz Patel Sahab, and he mentions that Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad was taught the 10 surahs, the final 10 surahs of the Quran by Hafiz Patel Sahab. Now, I believe that Hafiz Patel went for Umrah, and that's where he met a scholar of the subcontinent who basically told him about to make the effort of deen, to call people towards Islam, and he took upon that message. He took upon himself as his life's mission from that day until the day that he passed away, which is just crazy to think about, and the sort of impact that he had on the lives of people living in modern Britain.
Not just UK,
Yeah.
Europe, the entire world.
Hmm.
Like he's like very famous. Like wherever you go, like isn't in Albania they have a street named after him?
Yeah. There's a street that's named after him in Albania.
Yeah,
We even within like the two Americas, North
Yeah.
and South America as well. He's well known in them countries as well. He passed away recently. He's maybe been about 5 years or so.
2016.
Yeah. Honestly, I still miss him, Kasim. Like, whenever I wouldn't say that I had like any sort of close personal relationship with him at all. It was just seeing him from a distance.
Yeah.
But there are some personalities in the world that you don't require a close personal connection with that person to know or to have a feeling. You won't know. You just have a feeling that there's something special about this
Yeah.
person. And when we saw him, and even like we've listened to some of his talks, and we sat in some of his talks as well. There was just something about him.
Yeah.
It was just something different. And maybe through his sacrifices that he's given, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him that ability. We know even like about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well, that he didn't necessarily need to speak to individuals for them to be influenced by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even just a glance or a look at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sufficient to turn the heart of a person, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, we'll include an obituary below in the description. But that's one particular personality. Who made an effort more on like a sort of grassroots level on individuals, and that sort of just snowballed and continued. I think the news articles mentioned that when he passed away, as is customary within our religion, that normally the person is buried within 24 hours. But even though he was buried within 24 hours, there were, I think, over 20,000 people that attended his funeral. Which is probably one of the largest funeral processions in the UK, which is just crazy to think about. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept his efforts and continue his legacy. But that's the word, isn't it? The word that is, he left a legacy behind.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention?
I don't really, let you mention
it. So the second person that we want to talk about is Sheikh Yusuf Motala, عليه, who, again, his mindset was on establishing the Muslim community within modern Britain, and he was the first scholar to set up an Islamic institution in Britain. I believe in the 1980s he set up a Darul Ulum, or which literally translates to a house of knowledge, essentially an Islamic institution for the training of scholars. And he basically provided education, both Islamic education as well as secular education, since approximately the 1980s, in which I would say hundreds of scholars have been trained. Yeah,
tens of thousands more.
Yeah, have been trained, and he basically set the precedent where we couldn't even imagine about Islamic institutions to exist. He set one up, and not only do I believe that one to be the first Islamic institution for Islamic scholarship in Britain, I actually believe that one to be the first one in the West.
In the Western Hemisphere, I'm sure.
Yeah. So we're talking Europe's and
even
Europe and the two Americas. Again, so his sort of vision was more about the training of Islamic scholars, and the thing is that we don't, obviously there is a need for scholarship in every place, right? But the training of scholars within that particular environment or that own society helps in terms of dealing with the societal challenges that exist only within that area, and I believe that was basically his vision. Again, he spent many years, and there are many scholars that have come out of that particular institution. Not only have scholars come out from that institution, but institutions have been set up from that institution as well. Not just within the UK, but also, like we said, spanning across to Europe and the two Americas as well, which is just crazy to think about. What they did, not just through their own individual efforts. You see, they were pioneers and visionaries that they understood that it wasn't just their efforts that were going to be enough. they knew that they had to leave a legacy and a footprint behind on other people or a group of people that would essentially carry on beyond them, and that's what they've done, you know. But it takes visionary thinkers to think like that, and to then act upon that as well, and to go through all the sacrifices and the trials and tribulations that were needed to go through to basically fulfill their objectives. Again, we'll leave like an obituary in the description below for anybody that wants to read further. Now we've talked about the impacts and the legacies of these people that migrated to Britain and what they've given, and we want, like I said, we want to celebrate their achievements and what they've done, and we want to talk to them about them in a positive light. But essentially, what the purpose about talking about all of this is, it doesn't stop there. And what sort of my understanding is that whilst these people have done great things, and these institutions have been established and so much change has occurred within the last 50, 60 years, it doesn't stop there. We need to continue to improve the conditions for Muslims living within Britain. So I don't know, like, you know, especially in the current age of secularism, we need to make an effort that, I don't want to say, and you corrected me before on this, we don't say that so that Islam will flourish. No, so that our generations and we as Muslims will continue to be linked with the flourishing of Islam. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
It's very important just to mention that the challenges now the Muslims are facing are a bit different, and that we as Muslims, we need to adapt. We need to kind of understand the challenges which are arising in our society, and the challenges which are going to come, which are going to be here for a long time. And how do we, as like these sort of people, visionaries, deal with these sort of problems? What are we doing to actually protect ourselves? Because it's not protecting yourself or looking after yourself for 1 or 2 years. It's a generation thing, basically, until you die. Okay, which for us is going to be what, the next 30, 40, if Allah gives us a life that long, which is the next 30, 40 years, or 50 years, 60 years if we're lucky. And then, so this is sort of vision that we have to have. That, okay, we're living in Britain now. We have all these institutions, we have all these things that are set up for us. But then how do we move forward now? We can't stay in the same place. Yeah. We need to adapt, we need to change, we need to keep on evolving. We need to keep educating ourselves. And if we keep doing that, then alhamdulillah, we'll be able to help with the flourish of Islam. Allah will look after His deen. Allah doesn't need me, doesn't need you, doesn't need anybody. That's the reality of it. But how can we be part of that flourishing? And we mentioned it before, like, in Britain or even in the West, you see so many reverts. And mashallah, these revert brothers and sisters, mashallah, they're doing a lot of work, Why? Because they have this desire that, you know what, Islam does have the problems that modern society is facing. Like, look at modern society today. We look at other countries. Oh, this is a third world country. This country is in. We look at the West and the so-called advanced countries in America or in Australia or in the UK or in the Western Hemisphere. Where's the highest rates of suicide? In the West. Highest rates of abuse in the West. Drugs, alcohol. All these things are all in the West. Yet we live in the most modern society. But there are problems still here. We're not as advanced, or we're not living such a happy life as people think.
I think the other thing to mention here is that whilst we've been growing up and the Muslims have started to become more and more prevalent within society in the West, I think currently our perspective has been one of a defensive attitude, where we're constantly trying to defend our faith. And whilst that's very important, and we need to skill ourselves in being able to defend our faith as well, that's for sure, right? But I do think that we also need to be able to come onto the front foot as well, where we need to be able to challenge normative society in some of the concepts that they have. And I think that's the way that, inshallah, we can present the solutions that Islam presents. And this is like really interesting to talk about, because the question is, like, how do we go about doing that now? How do we come onto the front foot now, rather than being in a defensive mindset and always being the person who sort of answers the questions that other people are giving? We need to come on to a platform or a pedestal where we are now the ones asking the questions now and saying, well, okay, you've asked such a question now. This is what we have as our answer, but here's a question that we'd like you to answer. You know, and many of these such questions exist where currently the societal norms that exist within this country can't provide answers for, but Islam has the solutions to them. Don't want to go too much into detail now. I'm more talking about like the sort of the theory behind that. I'd be interested to hear, inshallah, actually, if people have ideas about this. What are their thoughts? Should we be more defensively rooted and continue to be defensively rooted, or do you agree that we should also come more onto the front foot and challenge societal norms? And what do you think is the best way to do that? What do you think is the best way going forward? I don't know, Kasim, is there anything else that you want to mention here?
I think we can only have this conversation with a friend, so we can only come on to the front foot if we're confident first in our deen, and second of all in the knowledge that we have. Otherwise, if you're not confident in these two things, we will always be on the defense. But we'll always be, oh, sorry, that doesn't represent Islam. Oh, sorry, this happened. Well, we always be apologetic Muslims. But we're not meant to be apologetic Muslims. There's 1.7 billion Muslims. Just because one or two people do something wrong, it doesn't brand all of us as the same.
Yeah.
So if we equip ourselves with the right sort of knowledge, the right sort of training, and the right sort of mindset, and the right sort of faculties, alhamdulillah, we can present Islam in the way that's meant to be presented to people. But until we don't do that, until we don't make them sort of sacrifice of us taking out just our time, to be honest, and learning, then we will struggle living in this society.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the challenge is now is not to do with our wealth necessarily. Like we don't have to sacrifice huge amounts of our wealth. I also don't think like there's a huge amount of like sacrifice to be made in terms of like our health as well. Like for example, we've mentioned about the early Muslims coming and living in difficult conditions, working and having really difficult work-life balances and things like that. I don't think, like I said, I don't think that's where the sacrifice needs to be made. I do agree, though, that the sacrifice needs to be made in terms of our time. So we need to invest our time in the correct manner to upskill ourselves, basically. So that we present Islam in a better light, and we are involved in projects or organizations or ways in which we can present Islam in a better light to society.
I'll just mention one story. There was in Arabic they call them mustashriqun, Orientalists.
Okay.
So you find a lot of them in Egypt. They go there to learn Arabic. It was very, very open for them, mashallah. So there was one woman, she was actually sent from the United Nations. And she was sent to Egypt to learn Arabic. And they said to her, after you learn Arabic and you acquire the language, and go into the villages and go talk to the simple Muslim and take them away from their religion, basically. But she mentioned herself that she came to Egypt, she learned Arabic, and she learned Muslim, but then she became Muslim herself.
Okay.
It's weird how things work. But this is the sort of challenges, or how do you say, mental warfare which are taking place, which Muslims need to be aware of. There's so many things which Muslims, especially the youth, are facing. As you said, we need to equip ourselves.
I agree. Let's call it an end there, inshallah. Jazakallahu khair for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, inshallah, please do leave a like and do subscribe. I'd also love to hear your sort of comments that you have, or any views or opinions that you have on this particular topic as well. So please do leave them below. I think Kasim got one more thing.
I want to mention one thing. If you guys are from any sort of background, maybe Somalian, Arab, any sort of background, African, and there were people in your community who made huge changes when they came to the West, or came to Britain, please throw in the comments and let us know. Just because we don't know about it doesn't mean we're ignorant or we don't acknowledge it. It's just because we don't know. Yeah, Allah forgives for our shortcomings. But if you have people that that made a huge change in your society, your community, put them in the comments and let us know. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, definitely, inshallah. Jazakallahu khair for listening, and inshallah we'll see you in the next episode.